Well, hello, Automation Hour attendees. Welcome to this version of our webinar. We'll get started with just a couple logistics before we dive right in. So, Mike, if you want to hop to the next slide.
Yep.
All right, so all my lines are muted. However, we love your interaction. So please post your questions here in the question widget. You can post them in our Automation Hour Trailblazer community group. We want to make sure that this is beneficial for you. So get those questions in. We love the commentary and the banter that goes back and forth with all of our attendees. We are recording this and we will post this to our YouTube channel after the session's complete. So in case you missed something or you have to step away, you've got that resource available to you. We also have a variety of ways for you to connect with us through your social media of choice. So go ahead and hit us up on your favorite social media channel. And here's a list of the first half of the year sessions that we have done. We have gone boot camp for the year. And so we started out kind of helping you shape your automation strategy and get into starting to build those different types. And now we're actually into the second half of the year where we are going to continue through some of those best practices. And Mike, if you want to hop to the next screen, we'll look through the second half of your schedule. And we're also going to branch out beyond Flow as well with some of the other automation tools that are available in Salesforce. We'll get into best practices, we'll talk migration strategies, and we're even going to dabble a little bit with Apex. So it's full automation, and it's all fair game for us. All right, next up, we need to say thank you to our sponsors without whom we would not be able to bring this to you every couple of weeks with no charge. So first, Concrete.io, we would love to say thank you to you for sponsoring us since our inception. Our next sponsor up, we want to say thank you to is Sumo Scheduler. They have a great tool. If you've not checked it out, absolutely you should do that as well. So we thank them for coming on board as a sponsor this year. And finally, last but not least, we could not send you all those wonderful reminder emails without ActiveCampaign. So thank you to them for sponsoring us and helping us make this possible as well. All right, so yeah, your co-host, you've got me today, Michelle Hansen. Rakesh Gupta is also one of our co-hosts, but we know you're not here to see or talk to us. You're here for the real deal, and that is Michael Barnes. So Mike, I'm gonna hand it over to you. Welcome to Automation Hour again.
All right, well, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Just a little quick bit about me. Michael Barnes with NBC Sports Next. So NBC Sports is part of NBC Universal, ultimately parent company Comcast, but I'm in the golf division here out of Orlando, Florida. We formerly were part of Golf Channel, but we've been reorganized a little bit over the last couple of years. So now they've grouped all the direct-to-consumer businesses up under Sports Next, and we're actually Sports Next and Fandango. So I should have added that on here this year. That's a pretty recent change. The Fandango business is now also up underneath our leadership team because we handle all the direct-to-consumer businesses. And so primary businesses are Golf Now, Golf Pass. I mentioned Fandango. We also have Youth Sports and Recreation as part of our business. But about me, I have a background in engineering, earned an MBA from University of Florida, which is not too far from home here in Orlando. It's up in Gainesville. And then I've been a presenter a number of times at Dreamforce. Pre-pandemic, I've yet to get back into the swing of things, presenting. Didn't present last year and don't have yet plans to present this year, but if the opportunity comes, I'll be happy to present at Dreamforce. But Automation Hour I've been doing since 2018, so I kind of stopped presenting Dreamforce looks like and started picking up presentation opportunities here through Automation Hour. So happy to share my knowledge, what I've learned. I've learned so much from the community. I take this opportunity just to give back to you all, pay it forward as it were, and hopefully help you increase your skills. Highly recommend getting into your Trailhead if you haven't. As you can see, I've earned a number of badges. I'm a Ranger. I'm pretty close to becoming a double Ranger. Actually, I think this 127 is a little short. I think I'm higher than that now. I need to update that. But these are the certifications I have earned. I am working on earning a platform developer certification. That's the next one, because I do work with a lot of developers. I don't do a lot of development work myself, but in order to become a Salesforce architect, Salesforce developer is one of those requirements. So I'm working on getting my developer skills just up enough, at least so I can pass certification, and then continue on. The architect track is my plan. So anyhow, let's jump right into, this is not supposed to be where it ends. Let's see, 10, where's 10? I don't know why it's skipping 10, sorry. Let me just escape out of this and we'll just pull this up. I don't know why it was jumping past that slide. So I'm here to talk through a number of flow limitations. That seems to be my specialty. My team will tell you if there's a limit in Salesforce, I can find it. So some of the things I'll talk through today are really specific to flow limits though, which there are a lot of limits just within the flow application, not to mention the rest of Salesforce, which if you're not familiar with the limits, highly recommend you take a look at just at least a couple of things here at the bottom of the screen: execution and governor limits, and then flow limits and considerations. There's a lot more that is covered in these two documents that I'm going to cover today, but hopefully I'll hit some of the highlights that'll help save you some time and trouble as you jump into flow yourself. So I'll talk about null pointers, null pointer errors. Basically, you can't have, for example, Boolean fields that are null, has to be true or false. If you try to pass in a null value, Salesforce doesn't like that. You'll get an error. Email send limits, there's a maximum of 5 recipients you can have on a email send. I've got some tricks. In fact, if you look at my presentation from last year, I think it was May last year, I talk about a specific solution for how to send to more than 5 recipients an email that you might want to send. Avoid, I'm going to talk about how to avoid gets within loops. That's usually not a good idea. So I'll next screens are really going to be live demos. I'm going to show you some flows that I built just that demonstrate the wrong way to do things, and I'll talk about the way you should handle them. How to handle multi-select pick lists. Those can be tricky for anybody. They're great if they're information only. As soon as you want to automate off them, they become a little bit of a nightmare because the includes element is not always available for determining if a value is included in the set. So that's true in flow. There's some things lacking there sometimes. But I can show you some ways to get around it. So create and update. If you try to create or update multiple records, you might get a DML error. So that's where you're trying to do too many hits to the database. Basically in Salesforce, one thing about Salesforce, it is a multi-tenant environment. And so everybody gets their slice of the pie. And as Michelle tell you, it's not nice if you try to eat somebody else's pie. So Salesforce prevents us from doing that, keeps us from taking up too much resources that might cause problems with the overall server and systems. So that's why you're going to see a lot of these limits are around, because Salesforce is trying to protect the integrity of their multi-tenant environment. And you can only use, you can use your fair share, and that's it. So we'll talk about SQL query limit errors, which has to do a little bit with DML error, but that's if you try to query too many records, you're in trouble. There's a flow version max. You can only have 50. If you don't take care of your flows and purge them, in fact, and I'm guilty of this too. We do too many versions. Often once we start going at it, we keep adding feature after feature after feature. Next thing I know, my flows are not only really large, but I've gotten a lot of versions. So we'll talk about the limit there and how you can handle that. And then schedule trigger flows. There's a limit on how many per day. You can only run as often as daily as well. That can be a challenge. So I talked about what I do to get around those things as well. And just a helpful hint, if your flow is bogged down, and this happened to me just yesterday, which is why I wanted to add this on here. Flow is acting really slow. It's a very large flow. I'd made a number of changes. The next thing I know, it's just crawling. Every time I click on something, it's taking a second or two to open. Best thing to do at that point is save and refresh your browser. So just a word to the wise, if your flow is acting weird, don't fight with it. It will just drive you mad. Best to save your work, refresh your browser, your flow will start behaving again when it refreshes. At least that's been my experience. When it's bogged down, don't fight with it, just refresh. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and close the presentation slides here and jump right into the demo one flow. So I mentioned that, in fact, I want to put them over here so I can read them while I'm talking through the slides. So I mentioned null pointer errors. So one of the problems you could have, especially on screen flows, is you could have a flow that has multiple paths. In this case, I have a flow that you can go left or right. and you could have some decision elements, right? You could have a whole, this could be embedded right in the middle of the flow, or it could be spread out in your flow. But in any event, what the key here is that I have a screen element that has a Boolean checkbox, right? And it doesn't matter if I set a default value here or not. I can set one. I don't have one here set, but that's, it doesn't hurt to have that set. But the only time that that element, this element is going to be evaluated and even know that the flow knows it will exist is if you take this path. So I could do all kinds of other things, skipping this screen, which sometimes you have a flow where you don't need to go to a screen. There's a way to bypass it. And if I try to then save this update, and I'm writing that checkbox directly to a field in Salesforce, and I also don't recommend doing this. I'll talk about that in a second. But if I try to write this checkbox here, because I didn't evaluate, if I went down the other way, the right side of that flow, and it wasn't evaluated, it's going to try to pass a null value in here. So this is a bad practice. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I also wouldn't recommend doing hard coding IDs either. I'll talk about that in a second. But to solve this first problem is to use an assignment. So I highly recommend always use assignment elements inside of your flows. So if you click add, it should prompt you to add an assignment, which it's being tricky probably because I'm on a webinar. Here we go. No, it's went away. I overclicked. So use assignments are where you want to set your, you want to assign variables. And if you're going to so there's a couple different ways you can update records, but this, you probably, if you've been on the other webinars, you've probably seen there's a number of ways to update and set values on records. But if I just want to say, set Boolean, and let's see if I create the variable already. No, I didn't create one. So I'm going to say new resource, which you can do here, and I can say variable, and this is going to be the checkbox variable. I always put that so I know it's a variable versus an input element on a screen, just easily looking at it. And then I'm going to say that's Boolean. And then this is where you want to set your default value. I'm going to set that to false and say done. So now I'm going to say the checkbox is equal to my input screen component. So now this variable, that I'm setting here is false from the very beginning of the flow. I don't have to evaluate this side of the flow. So when I get down to the bottom, when I get to the end where I'm actually making the update to my record, I'm going to, instead of using this directly, I'm going to say, I want my Boolean, my checkbox variable there, right? And I'm going to save that way. So that is the best way to anytime you have screen components, highly recommend you set variables and then do your updates at the end based on your variables. Another way to do, let me talk about this before I talk about another way to set variables, but I mentioned you shouldn't hard code IDs. We should always have like a lookup element. So I'm trying to look for a specific contact. Instead of setting the ID, hard coding, again, it's just the best practice is to look up your record maybe by name or by some other attribute that's maybe a unique ID is even better than name. But if the name's is going to be consistent or is unique, you can use that. But if you look that up in another get element and then use the results of your get element here, that's a smarter way than hard coding IDs. That was just wanted to show that off while I was thinking of that. All right, so that's the first thing. That's null pointer errors. Just be very careful with those. Another way you could handle that is I could do a get contacts up here at the beginning. So I could say do a get and this is, and then we want to say get the contact, and I could say contact object, and I could say where the I could say the name is equal to Michael Barnes. Now that may not be best because maybe Michael Barnes is not the unique name in the database. So I might want to use email address or something, some other unique identifier. Well, just for demonstration purposes. One thing I didn't show you there is at the bottom, if you haven't seen that, you have of course, I'm only looking for one record. I could look for all records, in which case I would have to probably loop through them because it would create a collection. But if I only choose the first record, it's only going to give me a single record variable. And then I always leave this these days, automatically store variables. The old way to handle flow was to actually specifically assign fields to variables, and that becomes, to me, just a nightmare to maintain. I haven't found a good reason. Maybe Michelle chime in and tell me later that there's a good reason for those. But I find that even in my largest objects with lots of fields, automatically storing all fields works terrific. I never have a problem with it. So I've been, even old flows that are now been migrated, now or pull up in the current flow builder. I'll if it makes sense to, I will change the way it's handling the get elements just to make them simpler. Because then if I have my get, instead of assigning that variable like I did before, I can now set that contact that I got. I can set the active checkbox, again, based on the input from the screen directly onto that record variable. And then when I'm on my final screen, instead of updating a specific record, I can just choose the records I want to update, which is the contact, the single record variable. And that's, to me, a lot cleaner. In fact, you'll see that in all my flows, since this became my standard, it's always using assignments that typically update record variables, whether I get the record variable initially or I just create my own record variable and then set the ID based on other inputs coming from other places if that's necessary. So anyway, that's just, again, this now much cleaner, better flow than what I had when we started here. So hopefully that makes sense.
We've had a couple of questions that have come in, and I
Sure,
think
yeah,
those
let's go.
are pretty timely. So Monica wants to know, do we have any limit on how many variables we can have in a flow?
Good question. I haven't hit that limit yet, so that's maybe in the flow limits. Since I use a get element like this now or record variables, I don't have to create as many variables as I used to. So I created variable for every field that I was going to work with in my flow. Which the problem is, once you go that route and you say, you choose the fields or choose the object and fields, which is even more treacherous, or in separate variables. If you start doing this, where you want to store all your contact fields, separate variables, you can do that. So when it reads the record, it stores all the initial values into those variables. The problem with that, with doing that, is then you own it. You have to then maintain all these variables. So I've not hit the limit, so I don't have a good answer for is there a limit on variables, because I just have not hit that limit. But I also find that using record variables is a great way to avoid any kind of limit on variables. But I've had many variables and have never come across any limits on them.
Neither have I, honestly. So, and I've never seen it listed in any documentation that there's a limit. Like, I don't know if you would have 10,000 or so, if that might hit a limit somewhere.
I'm sure at some
But I
point
think
you're going to hit
really,
some kind of flow size limit.
yeah, it probably depends on how often they're used too. So,
Sure.
so Nikolai would like to know, what are your thoughts on using a formula resource in the update versus using, oh, and I just totally clicked off of it, so I can't see the rest of the question, versus using the assignment. So instead of setting the Boolean in the assignment, you can set the field in the update records to a Boolean formula that evaluates what happened.
That would be valid too. Now the reason I wouldn't do that is because I wouldn't want to, like, maintenance would get a little tricky. Then I'd click in, I'd be like, well, what's this thing? And then I have to go, dig into my formulas to see what those formulas are really doing. I just find this is a little cleaner design. That design would be completely valid, as far as a formula is always going to be evaluated. So as long as that formula is, as long as your formula is built properly to say, well, if this is null, my input is null, then return false. That would also be valid. Sure. I just think this is a cleaner method that I used here. That's all.
Sure. So I know Evan Ponter does a kind of a session on flows that talks a lot about performance. And I think he likes to use formulas to kind of decide what we're going to set a value to, if there's certain criteria, as opposed to using a decision in multiple paths. Because of performance, I think it is slightly faster.
Sure.
Personally, I've never actually run into a flow where that change in performance has made a big difference. And so I generally tend to err on the side of who gets to maintain this flow after I build it, what's their skill level, and can they follow it if we do formulas and you have to kind of dig into those elements to understand it, or is it easier to have decisions on the canvas that kind of walk them through it? But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
If performance is something that is a big deal for your org, that's definitely a way to do it and get a little bit more performance.
Well, so every time I do one of these, I learn new stuff. So Michelle is like a wealth of knowledge here, and I appreciate that. Because I did not
Mark
realize there
actually,
was that.
yeah, Mark Jones actually chimed in. Also, third vote for we're not sure that there's any limits on variables. But definitely labels for your variables can get cut off if they're super long, and I like to have very, very clear names for my variables, but sometimes concise is best.
Absolutely,
And
that's
Mark,
a good
yes,
point.
if you happen to run into a variable limit in your flow, it is definitely time to consider subflows. I agree with that 100%.
That's it.
So,
All right. Well, I will jump over to flow number 2 here. So I mentioned the 5 email sends. This is an example of a pretty in-depth flow. This is actually one that's I used my org. I just made a copy of it so it wouldn't inadvertently blow up the real life version. Of course, this is Sandbox too, so I couldn't blow up the live version, which is always a best practice. Again, do your builds and tests in Sandbox before you deploy, because you can deploy flows, just like you deploy any other metadata. But anyhow, the limit I'm talking about now is the limit on number of emails. So I've got a process here that's going around and it's looping through some records and adding different emails to a collection of email addresses who I want to get an email that I'm going to send from Flow, because I can't use, it wouldn't be easy for me, or it'd be a different design, but I found it'd be cumbersome to try to send email using an email alert, standard email alert, because there you have to define all the recipients in terms of relationship to the record that is driving that. In this case, I've got an external, a join object that I call contacts on activation that we can set one or many contacts on, and we want to send certain members of that join object an email. So I want to look them up and get them, and also get other internal users that again are may not have direct access. And so instead of creating all these fields on the activation object and then having to maintain all those fields and then populate them, which I could do that, I could loop through all these things and populate those fields, but then I don't know how many I'm actually going to need, because there's one, it could be one or many. The many could get kind of big. And the other problem, then now I got this big list. So I've solved the first problem. I don't have to deal with all those fields. I'm able to use existing objects, existing source of truth data to get to my recipients. But the problem is when you use this send email action, which is just the email simple here, which is it's pretty handy. There are some cool things that actually are pretty recent I'll talk about in a second. But the limit though is when it says add your recipient list, what it doesn't say is that you can only have 5. It should say right here only 5, because that is the limit. If you try to send to 6 or more, it will fail, and you'll have to fix your flow and figure out, well, how do I limit that? Well, again, encourage you to look at the May 22 if you're interested in more detail about how I built this flow. I just want to make sure it's clear about the limit. I did come up with I think a clever design for basically looping through every group of 4 or more. When there's still 4 or more in the system, I take the first 5, send it, and I keep looping through until I get the count of 4 or less. And then once I do, then I exit out of here and send the final batch of I guess 5, or the last batch of 5 or less. So I think it's a handy design just to sort the collection, loop. And that also I have, this way I don't send to the same email address twice, in case somehow the same one email gets put into this list more than once. I use the collection sort, which I also find a handy tool for deduping records in here. And then anyway, I just thought it was a handy way of managing that email send limit, which can be a little bit sticky sometimes. All right, so the next one I want to talk about is the multi-select pick list. So this is actually, did I skip that? Let's see, where am I at? Sorry, one second. Well, this has to, I think I got things out of order. Let me talk about multi-select pick list. That's on my list next. So in this case, I needed to get this related contact. This has similar to that email send I showed you. It has to do with our activation process here at Golf Now. And we instead of doing a loop, or instead of trying to do a loop inside of a loop, or actually I found I couldn't even do this with a loop inside of a loop when I tried to test it. I needed to get certain certain context, and I've using a field on the on this contact object. It's a contact join object between contact and the activation object. And I have like basically a type of contact type that I define. And it's a multi-select pick list because we wanted to make it easy for the users when they're keying this in, instead of putting a bunch of check boxes, which I could do, but then all of a sudden I get a lot of extra fields to manage and maintain. Multi-select, the team actually likes to use multi-select. I tried to avoid them for a long time, but I've all of a sudden found myself using them more and more. But they are challenging to automate, multi-select pick lists at times. So in lieu of trying to do a get, because you can't do a get to get to get information from a multi-select pick list, because the only choice you have is the field contains or equals, which sadly, if it contains or equals in your get, will not return. Well, it'll fail. It'll give you an error that you can't return any results for that for a multi-select pick list field. So Flow is giving us a little bit of a hard time here. So the solution to this is to use, and this is a Apex I did not write. But this was a managed package you can download. It's an unofficial Salesforce package. Just beware. But it's execute SQL query. I find it super handy. It does have its own set of limits, which can be a little tricky. The two things that execute SQL query has trouble with are more than one inner join. Normally in a SQL query, you can do at least 2 inner joins without having a problem. You do have to also understand SQL. That's the other thing. And then you also, it has a hard time evaluating null in null returns. So if you had a date field, for example, that's null, and you do the SQL query to return one of the select thing, and the select is a date, and it happens to be null, it will not handle. So it's another null pointer issue where it will actually just doesn't return anything in the SQL query, at least using this particular tool, which can be a little annoying. So those are the only thing. If you learn, there are workarounds for those things. So I obviously just try to stick to one inner join. As you see here, this is an inner join. And if I have dates, I've learned to create formula fields on the source object to do a formula at the object level to ask if that date is null or not. And if it's null, I'll make it true or false, depending which way you want to have it for your Boolean return. And then I just come back in here and say, and use in the where clause, say where that Boolean is true or false, depending on what I need it to be. So, but the nice thing about this is it can handle multi-select pick lists. So, because I have the option in a SQL query to use includes, and that's where, again, Flow would be nice. We'll have to look for see if there's I'm sure there's an idea for that somewhere, where you say multi-select pick list, have includes as an option in the get. That would be awesome, and then we would need this in this particular scenario, perhaps. But the nice thing is I'm pulling contacts, and then I'm saying contacts that are in a particular contact on activation record, right? So I'm able to do the inner join as well. So I'm doing inner join, and I'm also doing the where clause that includes looking for a specific value. And this could also be a variable if you need it to be. It has to be in the parentheses and single quotes, and then the text itself could be a variable if necessary, which I've done this on some other projects, and where I've actually had to create. And nice thing is it can be includes, and you could have a string of characters, comma delimited characters inside these parentheses and single quotes. So if you want to say, make sure it includes, X, Y, and Z, then it'll only return results that have all 3 of those things checked, for example. So that's super handy way of handling multi-select pick lists, and be able to simplify your flow as well. So if you had, instead of having to do a get my contacts, loop through my contacts, then get my contacts on the activation, the join objects that are related, that meet certain criteria. I could try to do loop inside a loop, and that's another thing I'll talk about here. You want to avoid that when you can. So in fact, that's where I think this one was going. So this is an example of what you should try to avoid. In fact, you get a warning here if you are working inside a flow and you try to do a database access from inside of a loop, you're going to get this warning. So you may have seen this. I see it all the time because there's situations where I can't avoid doing a database get or a database, get element inside of a loop, because I don't have another way. I just haven't figured it out. But there is a way for some use cases. For example, in this case, I'm trying to get opportunities, and I'm trying to get products that are specific products related to that opportunity that meet certain criteria. And the reason I can't, get, well, obviously the opportunity can only see opportunity object, and that has a type, let's say sponsorship. And if I'm doing my get products, I can say, well, let's just get the products where the opportunity type is sponsorship. Well, I don't have that option. I can find the opportunity ID, but there's no way to drill in on the get object, on the get elements. Now on decision elements, you can. So that's why, the loop works, because in the loop, I could then say, well, if I get all these records, I could then in decision element maybe check to see if it has it. So that's another way I could handle this one. This is just a demonstration course, but it's just kind of annoying. I can't drill in here or drill in further into this record to make decisions. So that's and again, one other way around that is to just get all the records and then loop through all of them and make decisions. Or if you're like, well, I don't want to loop, maybe it's a lot of records if you do it that way. In that which case, you're going to hit one of those DML errors we talked about, or SOCL query limit errors. You're going to try to pull too many records back, and it won't loop through 200 plus records. It's going to give you an error. So another way around that is, again, this apex action, which I find super handy. So I I could get opportunity line items, that have, and this is just simplifying that get statement. So instead of that get statement, let's see, let me pull up that get op line items. So that's over here. So instead of doing the get where I just get all the opportunities and then have to then loop through them to figure out the type, I can say, well, just show me the opportunity line items that are from the opportunity on this account where the type is sponsorship. So just the SOCL query simplifies what the get, it does what the get can't do. It can drill into the relationship on the opportunity in a way that gets can't do directly without having to do more work on the other side. And then I mentioned the other way I could do this. Say, well, let's say I only want certain opportunities with line items of a specific type. That's what this other one is showing, opportunity SOCL. And again, it's simple as defining opportunity and then your SOCL query. Again, make sure if you use a text template like I am here, which I highly recommend because it's very easy to write these out, just make sure it's plain text, because if you put it in rich text, which is the default, it will put all the kinds of HTML code around it and it won't work. So I can see I do an inner join just like I showed in the last screen. So highly recommend if you haven't learned SOCL. This is something I did not know 13 years ago when I started doing Salesforce. And didn't know a thing about SQL queries. I was not a database expert, just was an admin that had to kind of figure things out. And I've kind of been educated over time. And this is something I found is simplified my life dramatically, is learning basic SQL, or SOCL in our case, a Salesforce object query language, which is much easier than SQL. There's less you can do with it, less trouble you can get into. But it is super handy for just quickly identifying what's going on in your database. I was, for years, I went into reports and ran reports and had to figure out everything from at a report level. And editing reports, especially now in the Lightning report builder, can be a little slow, and especially trying to get results. Am I getting the results I expect? Learning SOCL query and then using, well, sadly, Workbench has been down lately. I don't know if anybody else had that experience, but I've been using another tool. I can't get to it here, but I can probably get to it here. It's called Salesforce Inspector. Highly recommend Salesforce Inspector. If you haven't tried this, it's a browser plugin. You can do data export, which basically gives you a query tool. Of course, there's always Dev Console. You can do queries there too, but I find this has a little bit better functionality than what that. Plus, it can save your queries, which is really cool. So anyway, that's just another plug for another tool that I use all the time. So, but anyway, I've learned SOCL. I'm waxing too much philosophical on SOCL, but it's super handy for just quickly querying data, and can be super helpful for if you want to use a SOCL query tool inside of Flow. So it's nice thing is you still don't have to write any Apex. You can download this app and then plug it into your flows to get. And it gives you what it does. It gives you a list of records in return. So you still have to loop through whatever result you get and deal with deal with it as a collection variable. It's a group of records in a variable, but you can loop through them and then you just do a single Apex action, and then you do your loop right after, and then you can move do what you need to do with those records, again, without having to do additional get inside of that. So hopefully some of that makes sense. It's worth checking out especially if you're used to using SQL or SQL queries, using for other purposes, you'll find that it's super handy.
All right, so Mike,
Okay.
we got a couple questions that are really good here. I'm going to back you up for
Yeah.
1 minute. Tracy had asked that email limit of 5 for that send email action. Does that also include subflows?
Good question. So it has to do with the email. It has to do with the actual individual, the action right here. So so you'll notice I'm looping through this same send email, and I could send 5 emails, loop back through, send 5 emails, loop back through, send 5 emails. It's every time it hits this action. So it wouldn't affect subflows because you could send 5 emails here in this action, and then you could go a subflow that sends 5 more emails, and it could have a loop that sends a bunch of emails. No problem. I have not hit, once I put this in place, I've not hit any limits. Of course, I also know I'm only sending to maybe 10 to 12 people, 10 different email addresses at most with this. So knowing what your use case is important. So I haven't hit any limits as far as how many emails could be sent in a single flow transaction. It's really how many can be sent from this element in a single instance of hitting that element. I find it a little weird. I don't know why Salesforce put this limit in place. I wish I did, but no, I don't think you're having any problem with subflows.
Excellent. Okay. Ashlyn had wanted to double check the Apex action that you were showing just a minute ago. Ashlyn doesn't see that in their version of the flow. That's an unofficial SF
It's a
component,
plugin.
right?
You have to install it. Yep, it's an installed package. You have to search for SOCL, execute SOCL query. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So I would just search for this. I don't have a link for it. I could search for it real quick. It's just execute SOCL query unofficial SF. I'm pretty sure it's under unofficial SF. Yeah, this right here, unofficial SF. Super handy. They have a number of different plugins. I've used a few of them over just recently, but this is that tool. So if there's a download link for it on here that you can, again, recommend you put it in Sandbox, test it out, make sure it works for you before you put it in your production org, as you would with anything. But this is yeah, it's all going to be in here. So
Perfect.
super
Okay, so
handy tool.
Francis,
But that's why you won't see this out of the box in Salesforce. This is a plugin tool. It's not supported, so if it does not work or fails at some point, unfortunately Salesforce support's not going to be able to help you with this tool. So that is the risk of using any unofficial plugins like that.
sure. Francis had asked, what is the difference of using the text template versus a text variable for that SOCL query?
Oh, good question. I just like working with a text template a little better. The text variable, you just have to put it in quotes. I think that's the only difference. You could just create a text variable and type out the default value, I guess. Yeah, so we can come in here, do that's just my preference, but yeah, could you do a formula where the output is text? The only difference is you have to put everything in quotes here, test, SOCL, and because the only thing that would get me is, and maybe this is a good reason why, because I had considered that before. When you have your SOCL queries, they could have quotes in them. So I'm not sure what happens to the quotes. You might have to do special characters in a formula so that the returns the quotes. So I just think it's cleaner and easier to do it here. That's why I do it here. There's probably a way to make it work inside a variable. I just find that it'd be more work than it's worth for me to figure out how to make it work. So I just use this instead. Because it's just passing a string of text through. So anytime I pass strings of text, I try to create text templates.
Yeah, so you have to escape the single quotes if you're using a formula. And the text template is definitely probably a good way to go, according to Nick. And I tend to agree with that just because you need single quotes and double quotes and all those things and
Yeah.
the text, and it gets a little hinky. And if you use a text template, it's a little more straightforward there.
Yeah, it does all the stuff behind the scenes for you, so you're not having to figure it out, all the special characters and such.
So this is actually a fun
just
segue.
Just make sure it's plain. Just a reminder, make sure it's plain text. Rich text, it'll just add all kinds of garbage around it, and then it won't work well if you start with plain rich text and enter it in. Any other questions?
This is actually a fun segue to something we talked about yesterday. Nikolai had asked, what are your thoughts on using the inner SOCL versus the new in operator with a get records.
Ooh,
Is
yes. So
there any
that,
difference in performance there?
so Michelle, you might be able to tell us if there's any performance difference. I have not actually employed the new in feature. Michelle brought that to my attention yesterday, so you can tell I'm not an expert in everything, sadly. Wish I was. But I would imagine you could use it. The only difference based on our discussion and based on what I figure, you get your records, and then you'd have to loop through them and add them to, add all the record IDs to uh, a string, right? And then you'd have to then in your next element get so instead of doing this right here, this get products, I could, after I loop through them and add all the IDs from my opportunities to a string, I then get products where the opportunity ID is in this string of opportunity IDs that I just created. That would work just as well at this point. Again, that's uh, it's. I'm trying to think what other challenges would be for that, but I think that would probably be just fine. I just find writing SOQL easier sometimes, especially if I've got with all the relationships and everything. I can think through that way better, but I definitely will be giving that in a try because if I can avoid again using an Apex tool, then that may help.
Awesome. Yeah, so the real kicker with the in operator or the not in operator is you have a get records, right? And get your first set of records. But instead of being able to say, hey, go get me whatever from in this set of get records, you have to loop through that and pull all the IDs out into that text collection variable. So there's going to be some version of a hit to performance just because you're having to do that loop and build that other collection before you can use it in your next get records. What that performance hit is, I will be honest, I don't know. I have not gotten to that level of granularity, but I think really it's kind of a matter of personal preference. And do you want to stick to using officially supported methods to do things, which would be the in operator versus the unofficial execute SOQL query?
That's very true, very true. And I again, I would
Also, Nina
recommend
had
sticking
mentioned,
to stick to where stick to where you can. I would stick to what's available in Flow first. I would go to these tools when you hit that limit, hit the point where nah, I cannot make this work. Or I mean, I've seriously had flows where I was doing this kind of element, um, before the in was available. I'm sure that um, I was hitting Salesforce limits. Like that's why I had to find this. This was my solution um, to get past those flow limits and be able to keep moving forward. But should I do the in method and still get the same result? Perhaps. In fact, I might be taking a look at that to see what I can do to. I'm constantly managing and updating my flows. So that's one thing I've learned about Salesforce is you're never done, right? There's always new technology, new features being released, and learning how to use the newest things. That's part of the reason for coming to these kind of things, and for me also making sure I'm up to speed on what's the latest thing in Flow and everywhere else in Salesforce. It's always changing. Good
I
questions
love
though.
our
Thank you
attendees.
so
We've got great stuff. So Bruce actually said there's an unofficial SF component that can build a comma separated string. So that might be another option. Nina said she tried using in for tasks and it did not work. So
much.
absolutely. I think it's one of those things where you try, and when that doesn't work, you try something else until you figure
That's
that
it.
out.
I
Tony
hear.
had asked, are text templates native to Salesforce or is that from unofficial SF?
No, that is native. So the text template is a resource option. It's been here as long as they've had the latest version of Flow builder, and it's super handy. So I use this all the time for like setting variable subjects for cases as an example, right? Where I want to include the account name and maybe some other information that's going to build a text string. You can do that so easy here instead of trying to do. You can do a formula for it too, but that's concatenating text. This is just you just type in what you want, drop in a tag, from wherever, and boom, um, you've got it going. So it's, oh geez, I went too many levels down. You can see it keeps going levels down. But anyway, you can build your tag, and then it'll, of course, once you actually get to a real tag, that's when it's garbage. But it'll drop the tag in, and you don't have to do any special characters or anything. You just build the text with your tags spaced in the way you want them to appear, and it's super handy. We've actually built one of my guys on my team built a pretty cool text template where he wanted to get a string of related records and just give like it was one value from the related record that he wanted to include, like a product name, from a related record, and display it right on. Let's just say it was this product line item. You want the name of the product, and you want to put it on directly on your opportunity in a field, just so people on the opportunity can quickly see in a single field all the the list of all the product names that are associated with that opportunity. He built that using Flow, so you just put the loop through all the related products, grab the name, put it in here, and then for a text template, and then his text template in number one, then the second version was just became iterative as he looped through. It kept adding on to the string with a comma in space at the end, and then after he was done, he just removed the last comma in space from the end of the full string. So pretty cool use case. There are some cool ways to use text templates. So.
All right, we got a ton of other questions, but I think we'll hold them for a minute and let you get through some more of your stuff, and then we'll circle back.
Yeah, we're getting close. I think I went a little out of order here because I jumped to this one before I think we were supposed to, but that's okay. So I'll jump to this one here. This has to do with multiple record updates. This is a limit that you can hit, where basically Salesforce locks records when it's creating or updating records. And if you try to, in the same transaction, you try to update the same record. And this is where somebody mentioned having subflow issues. This is where you definitely could have subflow issues. So you got to be very careful when you're making record updates. Let's say this is flow number one, this is flow number two. I'm updating my case here, and then I'm updating it again here. That can be problematic depending on how your flows are being called. So a couple ways around that. I mean, let's talk about one way around it. Let's say you have a subflow that's making an update to the same case you made an update to in the flow that called it. Again, the record could be locked from this flow before it can be updated in this flow. You could, instead of just going right into the second flow, you could set a Boolean and then run a secondary record triggered flow on a delay, some kind of asynchronous method, so that the first one commits before the second one runs. So that way it's committing two separate transactions. That's one way to handle it. The way to handle this scenario is and you'll see I've already did it the right way. I used assignments. So I'm getting my case. I'm then using assignments to set the values. But instead of updating the case right here, I mean, simple as I mean, this is basic, right? This flows can obviously get a lot more complicated than my simple example. But I can say, well, just don't do that here. Don't save here. I've already set the value, so I have the value stored. Oh, but then what if I go down this path? Then I won't save. We'll just simply move this to the end. So it's a good idea. Oops, I'm going to right click on this. I think it lets me do it. Oh no, wrong click. I need to click once. I don't use the auto layout very often, so I was just showing that because it's prettier to look at. Okay, so I can just cut the element, which is running a little slower since I'm on the webinar, so I apologize. And then I just click paste where I want to put it, and very handy. So now it doesn't matter which path I take. If I go down this path, then this path, or I go down the no here, then the yes here, or I go down both yes, I'm only updating this case once. So instead of updating it twice, I'm updating it once. So that's it's always a good practice to put your updates at the end. Only do one update or create per object is a good idea. Use record variables, either because you did a get at the beginning that created a record variable for you, or you just can create your own. You don't have to do a get to get a record variable. Let's say you passed in an ID to an auto launch flow like this. I could just do and I didn't need to get any information from it, from that record, so that maybe I need this. I could just create a case variable and set the ID equal to the input ID, case ID that that came in. So I've got my input variable. I could just say, I'll show you that just real quick, because I think it's worth seeing. This variable, I can say, let's say I just create a case variable where the object is a record and it's case, and it's not input. I'm done. This just exists in the flow. But then when I get to this point, instead of using this get case, I could say, no, I want to use my case variable and set status. Find that. And now don't stop here, because this is where you'll have trouble if you stop. Because if the case variable is only based on you defining it. It's not based on a get. So there's no ID, nothing pre-populated on that record. So we need to go to case ID. And oops, I totally hit the wrong keys altogether, didn't I? Sorry about that. Let's try that again. Case ID should bring me a case ID value up here momentarily. See, I've got a lot of variables and fields on this object. So right, so I got a case ID, and I just set that to my case ID. I do this all the time, especially if I'm coming in from I'm looking up one record, and for example, we have orders, and we have an object called install tasks. So I have my order. I start a flow based on this order. I know I have the order object. I know the ID of that record, but I need to create install tasks. So I'll just create a record variable, set the ID. Well, in this case, I won't set the ID because I'm creating a new. If I'm creating a new record, in this case, I'm updating a record, so I need the ID. But the order ID I can set, based on the ID that I have, so I can set the order relationship, for example. So this is just a use case where I have the ID and I need to update the record, and I don't need to get the case for any reason. I don't need to put that in there. Saves me a DML, and I can now just update a value on that record this way. And this is I highly recommend this method. Again, assignments set using record variables, because then at the end, all you need to do is say is point the update or create at your record variable. And it could be one or more. So this is another thing I want to make sure I talked about is you could be trying to create, let's say you're on a screen flow and you're creating a bunch of related contacts, and you want to commit them all at the end. You don't want to create them one at a time, let's say, or what have, it doesn't even have to be a screen flow, it could be a regular flow. But let's say you're creating a bunch of contacts. So your process should create a contact and then add that contact to a record collection. So a record collection is going to look just like a regular variable. So I can say cases var do record, just allow multiples. That's what that's for. So if I want a collection or multiple records on that object, I can choose that. And then what that lets me do is let's just pretend here that this is the second thing. So I'm going to say my cases, I'm going to add my case variable to it. And so let's say I was updating multiple cases here. That's a very better example. So I'm using cases as my so I have cases variable is where I have multiple, and usually I'll say update cases or create cases just so I know that what that variable means a little more. And then this is my case, of course, I was working with inside the flow. And I can use that same case variable to maybe work with multiple cases. But every time I'm done working with setting values for a specific case, I then write those to my cases collection variable. So now I've got it stored, and I can now use that same. So I don't have to create a bunch of different case variables. I can use one as long as I'm only updating the same fields every time, or at least clear out the fields that I set. Otherwise, it will have memory. That case var will have memory. I'll then add it to the collection, and at the end I can say, well, I'm updating multiple records or creating multiple records. Because it says record or record collection. Now I can just say update cases. Right, instead. So now I'm actually updating multiple records in a single transaction without having to, again, do a create, 5 different creates to create 5 different records. It will make performance better. It will also help you avoid for larger flows, hitting DML errors or limits of that kind. So super handy way to avoid hitting limits is to use record collections and assignments to add records you worked with into those collections. All right.
Absolutely.
So the
lots of questions.
Yeah. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer. I only got a few. I'm pretty much close to the end of the line, so that's a good time for questions.
Okay. So Tran wants to know, will the update be bulkified in flow? And I think there's a lot to unpack with that particular question. I mean, if we're talking record triggered flows run on a single record. And so there's not really much to bulkify with that, but like you said, the record lock is the issue with doing multiple updates in a record triggered flow. If you're doing a screen flow or a scheduled flow or something where you're working with multiple records, it's on you to do that, with the exception of the scheduled flows where you're setting the start criteria. And then
Mhm.
Salesforce actually runs an interview for each one of the records that fits that entry criteria, and then they do bulkify that for you in the back end. But that's more of an exception than a rule, as far as I know. Mike, what do you know about that?
So yeah, I'm not familiar with how Salesforce bulkifies things. I know there's not a way for us to do it directly in Flow or to define that. Salesforce does all the heavy lifting for us on the back end, as far as I know. So um, if you're and if you're running multiple records, you're calling an auto launch flow or something, and you're passing multiple records in, I believe Salesforce will bulkify, those actions. But I don't really know how it works in the back end because I haven't run into any issues with that. Let's just say, unless my individual transaction, unless I'm passing in too much into in a single transaction. So, for example, I use um, I use a tool to avoid well, in order to schedule flows outside of using scheduled triggered flows, because I don't like scheduled triggered flows, simply because I mentioned this earlier as on my list here. They only run once a day. There's some flows I want to run every hour. So to get that to work, I use a tool called Jitterbit. You could use Apex for this as well, to write a scheduled Apex to then set a flag, set a Boolean value that then triggers your flow to run. Could be your flow trigger, could be the checkbox. I use Jitterbit to do SOQL queries like we were showing earlier, and then I uh, query the records in, get IDs. I set a checkbox value on those records, which then a record triggered flow is set to run on. And if that record triggered flow is complicated, has a lot of gets a lot of updates, and I try to send 200 records through, it will my batch will fail. My batch trying to update, set all those checkboxes on many records all in one go is going to fail. So I have to learn and so with that tool, I'm able to reduce my batch size to say, well, I'll query all the records up front, but I'm only going to pass in 20 at a time, because I know if I pass in 20, it works fine, and I don't have any issues hitting limits. If I pass in 100 or 200, I may hit a limit. So again, it depends on how you're triggering these things to run. Apex would have the same issue if you tried to have Apex to batch a bunch of records, and to query a bunch of records, and then try to set a value on a bunch of records that then triggers a downstream flow. You'd probably get the same error. So it's important to know what your downstream flow is going to do, especially the subflows and other things happening. That you it's you you could hit those limits. So it's just changing your batch size to me has been my solution for it.
Sure. So that actually answered another question that Tran had. Can you schedule flows to run multiple times a day? And the answer is not now with scheduled
No.
flows. Right now, to do that, you either need a separate tool, like you mentioned, Jitterbit or scheduled Apex. I think there
Mm-hmm.
might be a tool in Unofficial SF that lets you hack that scheduled flow thing a little bit, but I don't remember exactly how it works. So while this is recorded, please don't quote me on that and do your own research. Thank you very much for coming to my TED Talk. Um, so yeah, but Tony has a question that I think is really good. I was thinking about adding an update records halfway through screen flow with 15 screens because sales reps tend to get halfway through, reset on accident, lose all their work. Is that not
Oh no.
advisable based on your suggestion to do an update at the end?
Well, goodness, yeah. So you're saying the screen flow, they have a screen flow, then it's trying to do a bunch of things in the middle of this, like between the last screen you have now and the end of the flow, and it's crapping out. That's what it sounds like, and not getting to the end for some reason. I guess that's the question.
Yep.
So,
So honestly, I don't think I would say the same for a screen flow as I would for a record trigger flow. Um, yeah, screen flows, I would say, anytime you need to close the transaction and open a new one, or if you get to that point, and people do tend to close out or lose all their work or something, absolutely putting some updates in there can be a good idea. The other thing
yeah.
I will mention is Salesforce is coming out with reactive components on screen flows to help you reduce the number of screens that you need in your flows. I'm actually going to be on Automate This in August, and I'm doing a demo where I took a 7-screen flow and knocked it down to 1, technically 2 if you count my success screen. So that may be another option to not have them get halfway reset on accident, lose their work, is looking at reactive screen flows and how that can eliminate some of those screens. But it's a very different kind of thought process for a screen flow than it is for record trigger for sure.
Yeah, ScreenFlow has come a long way. I'm now with the elements can be showed have dependent, dependencies, whether they show elements or not. So you can, we've had screen flows, of course, where page after page after page after page. We try to simplified our screen flows dramatically, just so that we have fewer screens, fewer clicks, through the flow. But that said, yeah, one thing I would say as far as complicated flows that have a lot going on, it doesn't hurt to also, and have a flow maybe set of triggers, set a checkbox that triggers another flow, another record triggered flow, and runs asynchronously. I've had to do that in a couple situations where I've had pretty complicated. I'm trying to make a lot of one thing happens, and it's trying to make a lot of updates across multiple objects in our org. And if my flows get too complicated, it will end. So I find using asynchronous flows to be a lifesaver there. So I'll run some things immediately, but then other things will either trigger on some other action in that same record, or the first flow number one will trigger something that will start flow number two that runs asynchronous or runs a minute later or 2 minutes later or something, because you can do on record triggered flows, you do have that, or auto launch flows, I guess you do have the option to, no, it's record triggered flows. The record triggered flows, you have the option to set a delay of your choosing, which is pretty handy, and a batch size too. That's another way to kind of also avoid too many records trying to get processed at one time in your flow. You do have an option to change batch size in record triggered flows. See if I've got one here.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So Nina actually has a question related to this update thing. Do you have a tip for when you're updating different fields at each step? Do you do a formula and then update with the existing value? She finds that causes history tracking issues. So how would you deal with updating different fields at each step?
So if we're talking about screen flows where you're trying to update different fields, or you're talking about like my example here. So if I'm updating status, then I'm updating something else because, again, this is high level. I could have different decisions have to be answered before I decide that I'm going to make that change or make change to X or Y or what have you. So I just find that it's best to make your updates where it makes sense to make those updates. So and the nice thing about using the record variables is I'm able to make changes to that same record in multiple places in my flow without actually committing anything back to Salesforce, without actually hitting the DML. So that's where it's powerful. It's that I can may not need to hit this element to actually make that change. I can skip it and I can only make a change to a different field, instead of setting a bunch of variables and then having to aggregate the variables at the end. It doesn't really doesn't really make a difference as far as how Salesforce works, as far as I can tell. But I just find in my practice it's easier to split things up where it makes sense to split them up and only set the variables you need to set on that record at the time you need to set them. Hope that answers the question.
Let's see if we get a follow-up. Goodness gracious. So many questions, y'all. I love it. I know we're just a little bit over, so Mike, do you still have a little bit of time?
I got the rest of the afternoon, so as long as anybody wants to stick with me, I'll keep going.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to see what we can do about getting through all these unanswered questions. There's tons. Okay. So Chris had asked this earlier, and I think this is a great time to bring it up now. We're talking about flow limits, and you talked about different ways that you use to kind of get around things. So have you ever used OmniScripts to solve for something you couldn't do in Flow?
I don't even know what OmniScript is. What is that?
So OmniScripts is part of the Salesforce Industries, the former Velocity stuff. I think you can also put it as an add-on to the standard clouds like Sales Service, whatever. It's very interesting, Chris. I don't know if you have any kind of additional things that you would chime in with it, but it does something very similar to screen flows. It's a way to kind of sort of build a guided wizard type experience for, I think, users or even external users.
So it's a screen flow
actually
type
be
experience.
covering it. It's definitely not flows though. We're actually going to be covering it a little later this year in boot camp, because it's not new but feels new because most people don't use it unless you're on an industry cloud.
So there's only two things I've used that like recently that are not Salesforce Flow that kind of do what Flow does. One thing is one second, I got somebody calling me. So one of the things is Nintex has a workflow engine. There's some other probably for workflow tools out there, but it can behave a lot like a auto launch flow like this, and but I find it to be a little bit clunky. But it in some ways it was better, in some ways it was worse than flow. And I only use it in some light use cases where I have to manage documents because Nintex is our DocGen tool. So I use it for routing and managing documents. So I've learned to just use it for what it's good at. I tried to use it to do flow-esque type things because I got really enamored by it. I'm like, oh wow, I can do all these things in Salesforce. I stretched it, which I'm good at doing that, find the limits of things. So I found it, I tried to take it a little too far. I use it for its basic intended use. It works really well. The other tool that I use all the time for front end things is Squid. So I use a SKUID. Just a small plug for that. I love that tool. It's been super handy for me for changing user interactions with Salesforce. It is an add-on product. You have to pay for it. It's not free, but it does give you a lot more options for front end, not only UI design, but also gives you action sequences that what they call their version of flow to do a lot of automation at the browser layer. So that's the only two things I've used recently that I could tell you more about if anybody was interested. Happy to talk about those, especially specifically Squid, because I do use that heavily every day.
So we did have somebody chime in that Omni Studio is pretty expensive. A couple people saying they absolutely love Squid. I agree. They're pretty awesome with a really good UI as well. So yeah, goodness gracious, all these questions coming in.
Squid can call flows. That's why I love about Squid. So I can create auto launch flows, and when Squid needs to do something action that's a little too complicated, I just pass it to Flow because Flow is much better at doing complicated actions, especially when you have to loop records and do other things like that. Then Squid's actions can get a little clunky once you get too complicated as well. So learning where the strengths are and the tools you use is that's half the battle right there.
Absolutely. Okay, so Rachana had asked, how do you handle the scenario where a get element record may return more than, or a get record element can return more than 50,000 records, even after you've narrowed your search criteria? Is there a way to handle large volumes of data with Flow?
So to handle large volumes of data, like with a auto launch flow or something, I'm assuming.
Yeah, basically, if you've got a situation in which like you're going to have more than 50,000 records returned, what do you do?
Well, yeah, that's so yeah. Good question. I know flow is not going to be your answer. You can't. It'll hit the limit, the SQL query limit, because you can only return, what, one or 200 records before you hit, and that's through the entire flow. So you could hit, 50 records here, 50 records here, 50 records here, 50 records. Eventually, you're going to hit that. You're going to hit that limit pretty quickly in flow. So if you're getting back a ton of records, this is where 50,000 is a pretty high number. I know Jitterbit. I use that to do a lot of large volume records. I know I can do it with Jitterbit because I'm sure I could do a couple 100,000 records if I had to, where I can query because it can query all the records that I need to work with, and then Jitterbit can then in its update back to Salesforce can batch in at whatever size I specify. So anyway, that's my solution would be Jitterbit. You probably could use Apex to do something similar. So a lot of folks do use Apex instead, where you can query a large batch of records and then use batch Apex to push things back into Salesforce, but basically make an update that triggers a flow in Salesforce. There's probably some other techniques. I'm not a super Apex developer, so I'm still I know just enough to read it and get dangerous, but not enough to make good decisions all the time. So definitely something to look into though, an Apex side for managing batching large volumes of records. And I think you can still coordinate it with Flow based on using batch Apex and batching in, defining your batch size in Apex.
Awesome. Okay, so Raghu had said, I need to monthly 2 random surveys for sales reps managers from case object when the status is not fulfilled. Can we achieve this with flow. Had done it with had it done batch flow before.
So you're trying
I
to pick
think what
random
I
cases? Yeah, I don't know about how to randomly pick cases. That's the only thing that I'm not sure what to do with that. But
yeah.
you can definitely use it to take care of querying for records that meet the specific criteria. And then, again, as long as it's not too many, I think, can you do, I don't know if you can do a limit. I think I know there's a limit on record triggered flow, but I don't know if there's a limit on, because I don't do a lot of scheduled flows. So I can't remember if there's a way to limit how many get pulled in. But there's definitely this batch size limit here on scheduled flow, or I'm sorry, record triggered flows. So, if you're, I don't know. I'm not sure how to randomly pick records. We definitely do surveys for all of our for every one of our cases. So once a case is closed, we actually we use a tool called FormStack to generate a unique URL to the case, and then we send an email alert out using Salesforce email alerts to with the link to that FormStack form for the user to complete a survey, and then that FormStack form generates a survey record, and then based on where the responses are, our managers may or may not be notified to review and close the loop and do all kinds of things. So we use Flow and Flow for both sides of that, for sending the email and for handling the responses, and it all works really well.
Awesome. All right. Is there a way to launch a screen flow when a condition on a record happens? This is a question from Kent. I can take this if you don't know.
I think the answer is no. You can tell me if I'm wrong. I know that you can. The only ways I know how to call a screen flow are with a button or with an element on a lightning component. Flow embedded as a lightning component. So I don't know how to get anything to pop up on your screen, because so you can tell me if I'm wrong, Michelle. Because a record can be updated outside of the UI. There can't be a UI component to a database update, as far as I know.
So yeah, the answer is not officially, however, as most things, Unofficial SF has a component called detect and launch. So you put it on your record page, it listens to detect a certain condition happening and will launch a screen flow from.
So this is really an advertisement for Unofficial SF today. There's a lot of things that it can do that, again, be very, very careful with using
Necessity breeds invention.
Cool. I tell you what, it's awesome, because you probably could write these things. I mean, the good news is all that stuff, I believe, is open. It's open. You can actually see the source code of everything, and it's using Lightning components and Lightning component design to build. So it's not like they're inventing something on the side. It's running in Salesforce using Salesforce tools and logic. So it's just that somebody has been generous to give it away, which is pretty cool. So it's nice for us to be able to go in and use that stuff without having to invent it ourselves, which, for example, that SQL query, I knew I needed that for a long time. And I kept thinking, how am I going to get this written? I need to find a developer. And then, of course, Unofficial SF had it, and it works pretty good. So I didn't have to write it myself.
So, all right, some more fun stuff. Nikolai, another question. With the removal of the 2000 executed elements limit, which was an API 57, would you recommend all existing flows should be upgraded to API 57, or are there any considerations with doing so?
Good question. I've not updated my flows, but maybe if I had one that was having an issue, it might be worth trying. So I would probably stick to updating only if necessary, if like the flow had a problem, or if you had some performance issues that you needed to address. Maybe updating the version might help. Definitely worth testing in Sandbox and see if it gives it, makes it work better.
Yeah, that's always it. Test in Sandbox, right? And honestly, I'll be the first to admit I don't frequently go back. Yeah, I don't go back and update the API versions of my flows, but I haven't had flows around on an API version being returned yet. So at some point in the future, you may need to do that anyway. Generally,
probably update it for. I would guess they would update it for us if they were getting rid of an API version and your flow was on it. Because I've had flows for 10 years. I've never had to update an API version. So
yeah,
there's that.
Generally, new API should be backward compatible unless they specify they're deprecating some sort of supported functionality. So I don't know that there's any, key considerations for that.
Sure.
Tran would like to know, do you have a free or paid license of Jitterbit?
Oh, so I have a paid license for Jitterbit. That's a good question. I did use the free version. The free version's okay. It is not great, especially once you get once you get the paid one, it's like night and day. But the paid, I pay for the Cloud Studio. Highly recommend the Cloud Studio. There is a server-based version which we have running as well. That I actually have a project to migrate everything to the cloud because. And it's in process. It's going on right now to get everything out of the server because our server has not been super stable and great. So that said, Cloud Studio, it takes a little bit of effort to learn. It is not super intuitive out of the box, just to make that clear. It's a lot less intuitive than Flow, if you can believe it. It's a lot less intuitive than Flow. But once you figure it out and get some training on it, which I just had their support team train me on it and said, hey, here's what I'm trying to solve for. They helped me build the queries, learn how to use the query tool, help me do the updates to Salesforce. It's basically, I just do queries. I'm doing a lot of Salesforce. I query Salesforce and then I update Salesforce. Not in any event, we do have a paid version, and that's because it's the Cloud Studio, which you have to pay for, is a lot easier to use. Unless they have a free version of the Cloud Studio right now. I don't know if they do, but because I've been on paid Jitterbit now for a few years, and I will not go back to the free version, mostly because I also get support. So if something goes wrong, obviously you're not going to get any support on the free version. Paid version, I now have support, and I very rarely had to use it, mostly for training to learn, figure out why my stuff's not working, and have their support team help me out. But stability-wise, the Cloud Studio has been great. It's generally spot on and runs well. Just word of the wise, don't create too many workflows inside of a single project. Create multiple projects as needed. Just if you do use Jitterbit, that's my only advice at this point. Is too many workflows will make your project bog your project down and make it not deployable, which gets really bad. So I've had to break some projects apart into multiple other projects, and then everything is fine again. So I know that's not doesn't make sense to anybody who doesn't use Jitterbit, but if you do get in there, you'll understand.
Well, Tran did say thanks for clarifying, so I think that definitely helped. And I think we may
Absolutely.
have finally gotten through all of the questions.
Sweet. All right. Well, I mentioned earlier Flow version count 50. Just the solution to that is test. Use debug. Don't keep activating your Flow version until you've tested it. Save, test. Make sure always save, then debug, then activate. If you do that order, save, debug, activate, you'll create fewer Flow versions. If you do create too many, which I have, I've hit the max a few, more than once. Do like me, get an intern to go through and delete all your Flow versions that are too many. I have an intern working on that right now. So it's a real problem. You will try to save your Flow, and it'll say, sorry, you exceeded the number of versions, which is really disappointing. Obviously, don't close that browser window. Go open another browser window, find the Flow, open, see all the versions, start deleting the old versions so you can save the current version. You have to delete at least one so you can save the current one. But get an intern to delete the rest of them, and it'll save you some hassle. Otherwise, I think we talked about everything else, so I don't have anything else to share. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate all the questions. They're really great questions.
This was a wonderful interactive session today. So Mike, thanks again for presenting on flow limits. Thanks everyone for joining, and we will see you in 2 more weeks for our next episode. Have a great rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.